As much as we try to deny it, length matters. Some people are enticed solely based on length. Some people believe that things need to be as long as possible, but I'm of the view that a shorter length is perfectly fine, and it's actually about what you do with what you have, and not how much of it there is. Plus, the minimum is 3, so if it's 3 or more, maybe that's all you need, and there's no need to turn your nose up at one just because it happens to fall short of what you think the acceptable size should be. There's nothing wrong with being short. I'm talking about the length of an anime series, by the way. Not many people discuss episode counts, even though we're all aware that they clearly impact how an anime is produced, as well as the kind of story it can tell. So here's a handy guide about what the length of a series can tell you about it. But before we start, here's a few basics. The average anime episode is designed to be consumed within half an hour, and split halfway through to allow for an ad break. This means that most of them are approximately 24 minutes long, give or take. In fact, it tends to be a lot more take than it is give, since there are opening and ending sequences which on average last about 1 minute and 30 seconds each. Most anime are aired weekly, starting at the beginning of a seasonal block, which lasts for 3 months and is sometimes referred to as a cour. Just so you're aware, I'm defining a series as a single continuously airing block of episodes. So while Mob Psycho 100 as a full series has an episode count of 37, each individual series of Mob Psycho has an episode count of 12 to 13, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But now that I've done some explanation, let's get on to the bit with the nice looking circles. If a series is longer than 39 episodes, that means that it's likely a full adaptation of something, or that it's a weekly anime that could potentially even be airing today. Bear in mind, these are often only reserved for incredibly popular series, since no one would be willing to fund that many episodes unless there was confirmation that it was attached to a property with a lot of moolah. From a story perspective, the series will start and then will not end until they either finish the story or have confirmation that they can go on hiatus and then come back with an even longer series, as was the case with Fairy Tail. These series will change over their OPs and EDs largely dependent of the arc the show is currently adapting, although it's preferable that they change over these OPs and EDs every 13 episodes to keep with the seasonal model. Over the past few years, we've seen a pivot away from this long adaptation method, because Shonen Jump used to take full advantage of this format, but in recent years, a lot of the newer Shonen Jump adaptations are split into shorter series instead of airing as one whole block, which in my opinion has really shaken up animation quality in a positive way. There are a handful of series that are running to this day which started a long time ago, namely Sazae-san and One Piece. If a series is long enough, it threatens to overtake the speed of the output of what it's adapting, and this is where the dreaded anime original ending may present itself. If you want a guide to anime original endings versus source accurate endings, then I'll put it this way. If they were any good, then Soul Eater not getting a reboot is something we could comfortably live with. But we don't live in that reality, do we? One-cour series are the most common format you'll find, and will be either 12 or 13 episodes long, which translates to one season of anime. If you want to watch an anime series that fits within this episode count, then the genres you're going to be dealing with can be narrowed down to all of them. This structure can be used to tell a single storyline, but can also lend itself pretty well to episodic shows, such as comedies, although even if the series is largely episodic, there's still likely going to be a concluding arc, which will either start or be set up in the penultimate episode of the series. And if it's a more story-focused series, then the seeds of this concluding arc will be sown in a 2-episode storyline in the middle of the series, round about episode 6. This format is the standard because the production timeline, while anything but perfect, is at least a familiar process for most production houses. On top of this format is also seen as safe as far as distributors are concerned, since it sticks around long enough to boost the source material's sales, but also doesn't take up as many resources as it would if it were a longer project. If a series has a story that is only 1 season long, then it will either stick the landing perfectly, crash and burn, or wind things down into a comfortable place with which to make a sequel, or just use that as an opportunity to say we're not adapting anymore, go read the manga. Original anime don't have the luxury of option 3, so they will either go for the first option or the second option. Though if the source material is popular enough, or the production team has a large enough name behind it, then a series can be given Next up, we have two-cour shows, which include 24-episode, 25-episode, and 26-episode series. These are spread across 2 consecutive seasons of anime. However, sometimes to ensure proper budget management, the second part can air 2 or 3 seasons after the first. Despite having more episodes, these are reserved for much less episodic series, as often there will be a couple of 1 to 2 episode long stories at the beginning before flipping to a much longer arc at the end, or potentially even for the entirety of the second half. Unless you're Shinichiro Watanabe before 2019, in which case every episode is its own thing. Two-cours often mean that there's a stronger emphasis on it being a game of 2 halves, and there tends to be a tonal or narrative shift towards the beginning of the second half. Some will choose to highlight this shift with a new opening and ending, although this is a fairly new trend since many older series such as Standalone Complex, Cowboy Bebop, and even recent ones like the first season of Demon Slayer will just have one that they use throughout. However, I feel more recent examples don't do it to adhere to tradition, and instead will do it just because they picked a banger for their OP, and why mess with perfection. If a particularly popular property gets an adaptation, then it will start off with a 25-episode series in order to animate the first few arcs, and then the next series will adapt only 1 arc at a time, and allocate an episode count accordingly. Take Attack on Titan and Vinland Saga as examples. Both chose to only adapt 1 arc as part of their second season, but Attack on Titan only did the 12 episodes for the second season, whereas Vinland Saga still kept its two-cour structure for its farm arc, as it realised it would need longer. There are also plenty of two-cour shows that won't bother with a second season because they tell their story from start to finish, and these shows are the ones that use their 2 halves both to contrast and complement each other. To me, the best examples of this are Gurren Lagann and Your Lie in April, and I was going to explain why, but in starting to write that section, it led me onto a tangent so long I'm probably going to make that its own video. Three-cour series basically follow all the same rules that two-cour anime have, and weirdly that rule also extends to the bit where a lot of them only have 2 openings. Of the handful of three-cour shows I've seen, Diamond is Unbreakable is the only one with 3 openings instead of 2. I don't have an explanation why, I just find that small detail weird. Though, speaking of small and weird, if a series has an episode count that is countable on the hands of someone who's just been forced to make an apology to a Yakuza patriarch, then you're likely in the OVA neck of the woods. OVAs, or original video animations, are one of the happiest little accidents to happen to anime. In the early 1980s, a guy called Mamoru Oshii really wanted to make a sci-fi epic series called Dallos, but owing to production issues and internal conflicts, the full series never came to fruition. However, the team reworked the first arc of this story into 4 episodes, and it was distributed not via broadcast but via VHS. With that, the OVA was born, a proverbial wall for animators to throw shit at to see what stuck. Sometimes series that air in any of the previous formats I've mentioned in this video will get their own OVAs as side stories. Since it's produced separately to the rest of the series, these OVAs are not subject to as many restrictions, hence why they tend to be better at showing off their bigger, budgets. As for original OVAs, they tend to be brief stories with a more experimental bent and a big emphasis on the animation. Perfect exemplars are Fooly Cooly and Gunsmith Cats. Brief, weird, and very passionately crafted by whoever was behind it. The episodes are also potentially a different length to your average 24-minute affair because of the aforementioned lack of restrictions that come with the format. That's also why there's more anthologies done with OVAs, such as The Cockpits and sort of Cyber City or Edo, which is understandable since it's either that or just do one very small singular arc. It's probably occurred to you that nowadays VHS isn't quite the universal medium it once was, so the OVA has technically died. But it also technically hasn't, because it lives on with ONAs, or original net animations. Kind of. Maybe. Sort of. In a way, I'll explain in the next part. Original net animations might have debuted on platforms that were driven by user-generated content, such as Nico Nico and YouTube, but now, with a broad enough definition, quite a lot of things can claim to be ONAs, namely streaming service originals. Big companies like Netflix are able to provide the average anime creators with less restrictions, meaning that OVA-type content is more likely to be found in a series original to those platforms. But at the same time, Netflix also want a sparkly new series that can compete against the series that are currently broadcast broadcasting, so they will have an episode count higher than most OVAs, but a little shorter than most regular series. This gives us an episode count of about 8 to 11, although a lot of the shows within this bracket tend to have 10 episodes. Worth mentioning, not all of the shows that have this episode count are ONAs. For example, there's plenty that were regularly broadcasted, such as Konosuba, Eden of the East, and the Shoshimin series. Narratively speaking, things feel much more focused, since the episode count doesn't let the writers get cocky in trying to do multiple storylines, so instead you'll get one continuous arc that's done very well. Things escalate quicker with less downtime, but with enough episodes to properly flesh out the characters so it doesn't feel too fast, provided, obviously, that the writers don't include too many characters. The master of this is Masaki Yuasa, who put together Devilman Crybaby, Ping Pong the Animation, and the Tatami Galaxy all within this episode count. When watching shows with 8 to 11 episodes, you can kind of tell why creators would choose to use this format, because, putting it simply, money. Despite what may have been implied earlier, even a single core anime series needs a lot of money to produce, and so budgets must be stretched to make what there is go the extra distance that it needs to. Why do you think that at least an eighth of your average 24-minute anime is devoted to a repeated animation sequence? However, when dividing the budget up between less episodes, it means that less corners need to be cut. Think of two direct comparisons: the Konosuba mainline series, where each individual series is 10 episodes, and the Megumin prequel, which is 13 episodes. From a story standpoint, it makes sense that the Megumin prequel gets more episodes since it had to tell the full story. However, you can tell what a difference just a few more episodes makes to the animation, since watching what Studio Dean did for Konobaku and comparing it with what they were able to do just the next year with Konosuba 3 really highlights how much more rigid it felt within a traditional one-cour format. It's like going from a stick of butter that you got out the fridge 10 minutes ago to a stick of butter that's melted just the right amount for you to skim your knife through it, to just slather on your toast. They are simply just not the same levels of smooth. I'm getting hungry. Even series that are actively choosing to adapt less of a story with a shorter runtime have done so because they want to ensure the quality of the animation and know that sacrificing a couple of episodes will make it worth it in the long run. You know what? While we're on the subject of sacrifice, here's one more category. I'm defining this section with a question mark. Now, this doesn't mean an indefinite episode count like with One Piece. Instead, I mean this something is a bit closer to this number is a little weird because it doesn't exactly fit into a seasonal block. If you want examples, Bakemonogatari with 15 episodes, Frieren with 28 episodes, and Made in Abyss, which technically had 13 episodes, but the last episode of the first series was an hour long, making the total runtime equivalent to 14 episodes. If a series has an odd episode count, it shows that the team's main priority was telling the story, and not just making sure it would fit into a mold. Yes, this might jeopardize the ability to air the series in full, but it ensures that the story is told in a satisfying way when the whole series is viewed as one. This isn't always the safest bet, as playing this gamble could lead to broadcasters just refusing to give the series the misshapen slot it fits into. Bakemonogatari was only able to air its first 12 episodes on TV, and then had to distribute the final 3 episodes online. But today, when we go back and watch Bakemonogatari, all 15 are in one place, and it's much more satisfying. As great as Bakemonogatari episode 12 is, it didn't wrap up the Tsubasa cat arc, and it would have made the series end disjointedly until a proverbial second season came along, which would have just had to awkwardly staple the climax of Bakemonogatari next to Nisei Monogatari, stapler pun intended. This solution would have created not one, but 2 awkwardly paced series. So I'm incredibly glad that Shaft clearly cared about what they were adapting, and knew that something so unique had to have a structure that was just as unique in order to do it justice. And they knew that would make it harder to broadcast, but they realized that it was better to jeopardize the short term in order to make the long term much better, securing the legacy of the series outside of the initial run. Now, as easy as it is to praise this method when it works, this isn't a luxury afforded to everyone. Some people are given their limits and are unable to do anything about them, as was the case with Wonder Egg Priority. This was a completely original show that was only given 1 cour, so it ended on a rather abrupt note. An OVA was then made that summer to try and tie up the loose ends, but owing to a mix of budgetary issues and a confused storyline, it resulted in a special so bad that I physically tortured myself while watching it just to make the experience bearable. In case you're wondering, there is a video of me doing this. I think at some point in it I say the word urethra. However, One Direct Priority's extra OVA was the result of being written into a corner, whereas all the examples I mentioned earlier in this section are of writers who knew in advance what length the material deserved and gave it the perfect amount of runtime to avoid this issue of being written into a corner. The one thing I hope you've been able to learn from seeing the different lengths an anime can be throughout this video is that a format that's built around a story is a lot more satisfying than a story that's been crammed into a format, and that there are many questions we must ask ourselves in the pursuit of getting things just right. Some things can be too short, and some things can be too long. Some people would argue that this video is too long, precisely about 15 minutes too long.